Dr. Mary Frances Berry is a professor of social thought and a professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, which tells you that this woman has a very fine intellect. You probably read in the program that she is a former chair of the United States Civil Rights Commission. So you know she has been an activist, and she is an activist, who has labored at the highest levels of American government to make our society more just and more inclusive and more equitable. But I want to draw your attention to what you didn't read and you don't know. Between 1971 and the year 2016, this woman, with all the activism that she was doing, wrote and published 13 books. There may be more, but that's all I could find on the internet. I'll leave it to her to correct my history of her. I want to read you some of the titles of those books. Long Memory, subtitle, The Black Experience in America. In 1982, that was published. A couple years later, Why the ERA Failed. Women's Rights, Politics, and the Amending Process of the Constitution, as relevant today, but published in 1986. The Politics of Parenthood, subtitle, Childcare, Women's Rights, and the Myth of a Good Mother, in 1983. Now, the titles get more interesting. The Pig Farmer's Daughter, and Other Tales of American Justice. Episodes of Racism and Sexism in the Courts from 1865 to the present, published in 1999. And this one, this year, 2016, $5 and a pork chop sandwich. Vote buying and the corruption of democracy. Whoa. For half a century, she has fought to achieve racial and sexual justice, the very issues that challenge us today. We are blessed to have with us this living legend, Dr. Mary Frances Berry.
All right, let me just say that I am so pleased that you invited me to speak. I'm always pleased when someone invites me because you have to understand that you never know what I'm going to say. Mainly because I don't know what I'm going to say. At my undergraduate alma mater, for years they would not let me come to speak. And then they finally gave me an honorary degree, and I was to come to commencement, and I asked if I could speak, and they said no. Just say thank you and sit down. But I fooled them because when I was in the Carter administration running federal education programs, Joe Califano, who was the cabinet secretary, was supposed to speak at a commencement there, and he had to go off to Europe. Some national leader died or something, and he had to go represent the president. So the president said I should go to the university and replace him. And since they couldn't say no to the president, I went. And I got up and spoke. But the president of the university introduced me by saying he didn't know what I was going to say, so he then took no responsibility. Let me just say that I had planned to tell you I'm glad to see the chancellor again, and he's a powerful speaker in his own right, and I'm sure a powerful leader, and the little bit that I had to do with it, I'm just happy I did it, and happy you're here. Glad to see you again. I've got a little Steinem story that, I got many Steinem stories, but since somebody mentioned Steinem, Gloria, I'll tell you one funny little story about Gloria. Some years ago, she decided that I should go with her and Wilma Mankiller, who was the first woman chief of the Cherokee Nation and who has passed away, unfortunately. We miss her a lot. and that the three of us should go out and speak at all these places and talk about issues. And so I went out to Wisconsin somewhere, the three of us, and we got there, and the thing didn't start on time, and we were sitting around in what they called the green room, which was a closet, waiting for the thing to start. And Steinem said all of a sudden, you know what, I always wanted to go and see what a men's room looked like. So Wilma said, well, why don't we go find one and look and see what it looks like? We're not doing anything. So we went down the hallway, and there was a men's room. And so we went in there to see what it looked like. And when we came out, all these people were out there, just, you know, they were going out of their minds about what we were doing in that men's room. But I thought, I have other funny Gloria stories, which I won't share with you today, but I was reminded of that while you were talking. Wilma thought it was such fun. Anyway, and I did too. I had planned to tell you some other things today. I had figured out what I was going to tell you. I was going to come here and we were going to celebrate Hillary cracking the glass ceiling and all that stuff. And I was going to talk about how from now on we would continue to have receptive partners in Washington to do the kind of stuff you are all working on and that you're interested in, and how wonderful it all was. And then I was going to say to you that how much I am pleased that here in New England, you all have these commissions on the status of women still, except Connecticut doesn't anymore. By the time I got here, I found out last night Connecticut didn't fund theirs at all and got rid of it. But I was going to say that everybody had one, even though I don't believe, looking at the budgets of these commissions, that they are funded adequately. They need more money to do what they do. So I was going to congratulate, and then I was going to congratulate Massachusetts for the equity, I guess it's called, what's it called, pay equity, or what is the bill you just got passed? Massachusetts for doing that, and Maine for the minimum wage legislation. I was going to say all that, and it was going to be a great time here. And then I was going to raise a couple of things that I thought you ought to consider while you are working on these economic security issues in the workshops with the bullet points that you have for what you're working on. And what I was going to talk about was the people who I call the people fathers down, the women who are fathers down. I'm always concerned, it's my whole life, I guess, about the people who are the worse off. I mean, those are the people I always think of first. And in my opinion, the people who are the worse off are not people who have jobs but don't have adequate wages. That's a problem. There are people who don't have any jobs. And there are people who not only don't have any, can't get any. They are the people who are the worse off. The women who, we have now a whole high incarceration rate in our communities, the Latinos and African Americans especially, and poor white women too. It's increasing everywhere. And in most of these states, as I looked at the information, you don't have adequate job training for them while they're in prison. Massachusetts has a program that works on job training for people who are in prison so that they can come out and do what. But what they have for women is just what they call life skills, assuming, I don't know what they assume they're going to do. But there needs to be, that needs to be expanded to them. Janet Reno, who died recently also and was a wonderful attorney general and also someone who I knew very well. Janet and I used to talk when she was AG and I was at the commission about recidivism and what to do about people who came out of prison and trying to figure out how to get jobs for them so that they wouldn't be going back. And we had a little plan, but we couldn't get anybody in the administration to work on it at the time. And I was hoping that now with this new, when Hillary got in, we were going to do something about that. But I would say that in your states, and it is really important what Ann said about that now is a time for the states, and these states in particular. I know you're not walled off from the rest of the United States. Sometimes you probably wish you were. To do something and to take action on some of these issues. And so that's one, worrying about training those people. And the other is to worry about what happens to transgender people. Transgender individuals, especially black folk, are the most vulnerable of all the LGBT groups. They are killed by people with impunity. We just had a couple of people in D.C. last week where they were killed on the streets just because somebody felt like shooting them and killing them. And they feel that nobody will care. And many of them are on the streets working, engaged in sex work, which I disagree with my good friend Gloria, because I think sex work for adults ought to be legal. Because not children, we're not talking about children, forget that. Adults who choose to do that. But anyway, they're on the street, they're vulnerable. Many of them do that because it's hard for them to get jobs. And we don't think about them when we think about women. The other thing is to talk about grandmothers, grandmas. In our community, I know that in many families, there are grandmothers who are taking care of children because the parents are either in jail on a drug offense, they're still in prison or something, and increasingly women, not just men, who are incarcerated around these issues. And we talk about new families and how families come in different forms. And we've got 2 dads and 2 moms and 3 whatevers. But we don't understand that a grandma and some children is a family too, when she's taking care of them. And all the rules about what benefits you can get and what you can do and so on, in many cases don't apply to them because they're not a family. And so you ought to think about that as you work on these issues. So I was going to ask you to do that. And I was going to say all of that and then go on to say something nice like, oh, well, still keep in mind that you ought to do something every day in the cause of justice. It may be a small thing, but just do something. And don't tell anyone else what you did because you're doing it for the sake of your soul, which is what I usually tell people. But we're beyond that now. Something happened last week, which means that we need to talk about more than that. Now we have fear, we have loathing, we have grief, we have anger, and it's okay to grieve, and it's okay to be mad, but don't do it too long. Just, get over it and move on. Some people, yes. I've been spending time, like a lot of you probably have, doing a couple of things around this. One is on the various nonprofit boards I serve on. I don't serve on any for-profit board. I'm on every nonprofit board you can think of. With conference calls and meetings where people are mad, they're angry, and some of them, they say, well, why don't we just punch those people in the eye, And I said, well, I don't think punching people in the eye is a strategy, It might make you feel better, but it's not a strategy. And so now we have to figure out what to do. And the first thing we have to do is to try to understand what happened. Have some facts and understand what happened. Sure, there were the economic issues, and I'm sure Elizabeth Warren, who's coming to speak to you, will tell you more about those issues and what she thinks should be done about them. And we'll find out whether Trump follows through on some of the things he said he would do, or if he's just a blowhard, and a trickster, in addition to being a buffoon. So we're going to find out. We're going to find out, depending on what the Dems do. But we know that. So there are people who were really concerned about their, economic security, we're told, who did this. And our Janet Yellen, who many of us were happy to see put in as the secretary of the head of the Federal Reserve Board, Now is because she's a woman, and she's a woman head of it, and we thought, isn't that great, you know, and she's qualified to be that, you know. I don't know if I have to say that to this audience, but everybody who's doing anything, who's a woman or a person of color, is qualified. So, you know. But now she's acting kind of funny, you know. The data that Kristen put up there about women's economic status, we know that despite all the happy talk about the recession is over and blah, 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 that there are a lot of people still suffering, and a lot of them are women. And we know that all during the Obama years, as happy as people were, those who were happy, to see Obama being president, a lot of people suffered through that whole period. Black women, for example, throughout the first 4 years of his presidency, had the highest unemployment rates of anybody, much higher than white women and higher than white men. And in fact, it got so high at one point that it was higher than the rate for black men, which was amazing. And when that happened, I got up off my do-nothing stool, as my mother used to call it, and got a reporter to go to the White House press conference to ask Obama about what he was going to do about employment. It was a press conference on Afghanistan, but I didn't care. And she asked, he called on her and thought she was going to give him a softball, and she asked him, what are you going to do about unemployment? But what I didn't like was she said, well, I have the data right here because Dr. Mary Berry gave it to me. She wasn't supposed to do that. That was not cool. But in any case, all during that period, there were women who I saw lose homes that they had bought, who were working on these jobs, and they had money and they had mortgages, and then all of a sudden, with the layoff of teachers and the bad recession, they couldn't pay the mortgage, and they lost their houses. And they love Obama, but they didn't like losing their houses. And having their families suffer. So we have had a hard time, and many people have. And the white folks who are screaming about the economy, and many of them have had a hard time. If you listen, I said to somebody the other day that what we should do is stop listening to cable news and start listening to people. I listen to people. I take public transportation and don't put in any earphones, so I can hear what the people are saying. I want to know what the people are saying. Stand out in the street, walk down the street, listen to see what the people are saying. I want to know what they're saying. I want to do as a poem that we used to read in the 60s says, listen to the bushy-headed brother standing on the corner talking out his mouth. You'll learn a lot. And so I listen to them. So in any case, now Yellen comes along, and we had what I thought was a consensus that we were going to challenge Trump on doing some infrastructure funding. And that maybe that was something I heard Warren say, that might be something that we Dems could get behind. And then Yellen comes out yesterday, if I saw it right, and said that we shouldn't do that the economy, we should just let the economy go along as it's going because it's getting better and better and better and better. But the question is for who? And so, and that we don't need any stimulus. Well, I think she's wrong about that, and it will increase the anxiety and the problems that people have if we do that. But again, Senator Warren can take care of that better than I can. And then in this election, there were the white women. My dear white women, not you, but the white women, the ones that voted for Trump. Now, 93% of black women voted for Hillary. The ones who voted. Now, we had a big turnout problem across the board. As you probably noticed, about half of them who were registered didn't vote. That book I wrote, The $5 and the Pork Chop Sandwich, is about voter suppression and turnout and what do you do about it and how do you do it. That's what it's about. But in any case, that was a major problem. People who said, I don't like column A or column B or C or D, and I'm not going out, or whatever their reasons was. But the people who went out, the white women who didn't, well, I understand some of them, because I listen on the street, who talk about how even though they have a job and they're middle class or they're professional, that they still have an adult child who's sleeping in the spare room or the basement, who they paid to put through college, who can't get a job that makes enough money for them to get their own place and start their own families, and that they're concerned about them. And we forget that women are not just an isolated individual all by themselves. People have families and networks, and they have cousins, and they have brothers, and they have all these other people who are in their family. I know I do, because they're always asking for something. And this is something that you have to keep in mind. I dropped the papers. Hold on, don't go away. There you are. Okay, all right. And so when they think about that, I can understand. They say, well, I don't know if my son or my daughter is ever going to be in a position to have a family and move ahead and be at least as well off as I am, and this economy isn't working for them. And so whatever Janet Yellen says, or whatever anybody says, Trump took advantage of that fear, that problem that people have. Now what we have, too, is it wasn't just about economics. It was about economics, but it was about race and class and gender. It was intersectionality, but it was backwards. You know, we always talk about intersectionality in terms of we're going to look at everybody and solve problems, and we're going to consider all. No, it was a change election. Democrats tried to run a status quo election. Status quo. How do I know that? Because they said they were. Hillary said that she was trying to extend Obama's legacy. I got that right. And Obama said she was trying to extend. That's a status quo election. Stay with the same party, move, protect, and preserve what we have. In fact, we got a change election, but the change was not progressive. The change was a reversion, but it was still change, okay? And if the Democrats were going to have a status quo election, based on the history of how you do status quo elections, they needed not to nominate Hillary. A status quo election means you nominate Joe Biden because he was the Veep, just like they did with, what's his name, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush. When he was vice president, and then they nominated him, status quo, Reagan, Bush, and go on. But there were good reasons to nominate Hillary. That's not my point. My point is, if you're going to call it a status quo election and it's not changed, then that's a problem. And it was changed, but it was changed in the wrong direction. Now, the role of racism and identity and immigration and all of that stuff. It was a referendum on resistance to the change we see and that we like. We say that we made great progress, that what the civil rights movement did and all the movements since, what we did is align reality with the goals of the great documents of our national life, and by that I mean the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and pretend like they weren't passed with racism and sexism at bottom, and cleanse it of that. That's what I mean. To clean them up and extend them. That's what the civil rights movement was about. And we did that in part because we wanted to be for American values. As a friend of mine in Louisiana always says, those people up there, she's talking about liberals, this is a white friend of mine in Louisiana, liberals, they always attacking my girl America. My girl America. I think that's funny. Anyway, and her girl America likes the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you know, all that stuff. And so what we were trying to do was perfect all that and make for all the people who make up this country and not some. And Obama's election, we saw it as extending the goal of doing something about the great movement toward equality and fairness and justice for all what I call the food groups. That's all of us. We're the food groups. Asian Americans, Latinos, African Americans, LGBT people, the disabled, and the poor of whatever race or color. We're all the food groups. And so we were trying to do that, and we were extending it. And Obama, to us, is a symbol of how we had extended it. Glory, hallelujah. But to people looking at that who felt they were left out, that was wrong. And they were getting more and more left out. And this has been something that has been a problem in American society from the beginning. If you look at the South before the Civil War and the white folks who had no slaves, or one or two, who supported plantation slavery and who went out and fought and died for it because it was a way of life and because it made them better than the slaves. And whatever they were better than the slaves. And what they got out of it, you say, what do you get out of it? Is being better in terms of identity. After the Civil War, they were given Jim Crow after Reconstruction. They got Jim Crow and made them still better than what they called us, which was the mud sills. We're still on the bottom rail, and they were on top. And so at every turn, when you get a change, the history of these things is, when you make progress, you go backwards. Liberalism is, you exchange it and then you get conservatism, and you get reaction. For every action, there's an opposite reaction. That's just the way it works. And so now what we are, and people see, we forget. We used to talk about how black folks who lived in what we call the ghetto then, we don't call it that anymore. Trump does, but we don't. The ghetto. The black folks who lived in the ghetto didn't have all the stuff, the material stuff, but they could look at TV and see that everybody else had it. And it made them say, well, why don't I have, whatever? And then they started, I want the athletic shoes that cost a humongous amount of money. And you start stealing stuff and selling drugs and all kinds of stuff. I don't have a job, whatever. But they see the life that other people have on the TV. If you are a poor white person and you're working on a job where the factory's been closed and you're making below minimum wage in your job and you look up on TV, what do you see? All of these sophisticated professional women, all these black people in your mind, all these Latinos, they all over the place, living large, in high cotton, while you're suffering. And you say, how did that happen? Things are out of joint. What happened to me? I am being left behind. They must have done it by some, nefarious means, although they wouldn't use that word, by some means that they shouldn't have been using. Otherwise, there's no way they can be ahead of me. So what are we going to do about that? And and then you see immigrants, or people who you think are immigrants. One of my assistants is always being mistaken for an immigrant. He's not. He's American several generations, but he's brown and got straight hair, and they think he's Mexican. Actually, he's Indian, from India. But anyway, that doesn't matter. So you get anxiety on the part of people. And when people are anxious, they do things that maybe they should not do. So what do? One thing you can do is stay in your lane, as we put it. Keep on doing what your job is to do when you're working on issues, work together collectively in solidarity to do them, but do the job you have to do. We had at Penn, in case you didn't read about it in the media where I teach, somebody hacked into our computer and stole the names of the black students who are first-year students. They're just out of high school and they're there as first-year students, and sent all of them nasty emails and pictures of people being lynched and all kinds of stuff, and just caused the most horrible psychological devastation and turned up the entire campus for days. Last days has been now a week, a little over a week, upside down in trying to assuage their concerns and the concerns of their parents, who are worried about their safety and everything else, and kids who, some of them say, well, we weren't even thinking about racism, whatever we're going to do, and crying, and you have to hold and grief counsel and everything else that you do in those times. So, and if you don't know it by just reading in the media what happens to people, then it comes home directly to you in what all of us on the faculty and everything else have had to just stop everything and deal with them, and we are still dealing with that. But what do? So you stay in your lane and you do what you have to do. But if you, in fact, want to do something else and not just do that, you can think about doing something that, in fact, is activism. I mean, some people don't have the interest in being an activist. They just want to stay at home and curl up with a book or go to sleep or tend their garden and forget about the whole thing, or they're too busy by the time they do the work they have to do and take care of their kids and do all these other things that they have to do. But if you're interested in doing that, there are all kinds of issues. And what you should do is what Audre Lorde said. I'm sort of abusing the language that Audre used. And when she said we ought to learn from the 60s, she said if we are to keep the enormity of the forces aligned against us from establishing a false hierarchy of oppression, we must school ourselves to recognize that any attack against blacks, and I would include Latinos, Muslims, any attack against women is an attack against all of us who recognize that our interests are not being served by the systems we support. Each one of us here is a link in the connection between anti-poor legislation, the shootings and assault on people, street harassment, which is taking place everywhere all around this country today, attacks on women, and resurgent violence against people of color, especially of African Americans, so that we all have a stake in this. That's what intersectionality really means. That's what it means when intersectionality rolls so easily off your tongue. That's what it really means. You know, none of us is free, as we used to say as we marched in all the marches I was in, until all of us are free. And that everybody is in it together, so you can become an activist. There are lots of issues. There's a sanctuary movement. Cities are sanctuaries, trying to get churches and schools and defending the communities that are targeted. Is Trump going to try to deport 2 million people or not, or 1 million or whatever? And what's going to be done about that? What about the Indians or the Native Americans in the Dakotas and their fight for what they're doing? What about fighting the right and the Klan? What about working to rebuild the union movement, which is in decline? And then the toughest one is to engage, for white people to engage other white people in talking about their racism. That's hard. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. I know it's hard. But somebody's got to do that. And that's part of the work that must be done. I look forward to the fight. You mentioned the Reagan period, and I look forward to it because I am never happier than when I'm embattled. It's the finest time of my life. And I'm never happier than when I'm with a little group of people where we are actively engaged in fighting against injustice and being abused while we do it. I'm so happy when that happens. I'm happy when I'm inside a building we took over and we don't have anything to eat or drink. I'm happy when we're sleeping on the floor and it's cold. I'm happy when somebody takes me off to jail in a good cause. I'm happy about all of those things. I feel better then. I get a high, you know. It's better than using the marijuana that you guys just legalized here. And that's another one that I had made. People who are getting out of jail, a lot of jobs they can't get because they have a criminal record. Since marijuana is legalized, will the people who are in jail for selling marijuana, when they get out, can they work in the marijuana industry? Have you all thought about that in the state? You ought to think about it. So it won't be easy, and it'll be brutal. And you may not remember the Reagan years, because it was a long time ago, but I do. And I fought Reagan so hard. From inside, I was chair of I was on the Civil Rights Commission. I was a member then. And I fought him tooth and nail. And he didn't appreciate it. he told the press, reporter asked him at one of his press conferences, why was he going after me? Because he fired me from the Civil Rights Commission for criticizing him. And I sued him, and I beat him in court. But anyway, the reporter asked him that, why are you so determined to go after Dr. Mary Frances Berry? And he said, she serves at my pleasure, and she's not giving me any pleasure. Isn't that interesting? The reporters took off after that one. And it was so bad that I was walking around on a cane, and one of the doctors told me I had to have surgery on my back because I could hardly walk. And finally, I went to another doctor, and he said, hey, it's nothing but stress. When this is over, you'll be all right. And he was right. But remember this, we won some victories. It was a very gloomy time, and when he was running, a lot of us said, he's never going to win. Here's a guy who made a movie with a chimpanzee, and he's nothing but a, blunderbuss. What is this guy? We said all kinds of things about him. You go back and look at the press back then if you don't believe it. And he won. But between 1981 and 1988, we forced the Congress, the movement, to pass more civil rights legislation than was signed during Bill Clinton's entire term or in the last 8 years while Obama's been in office. We also passed sanctions and to help dismantle apartheid in South Africa, and some of the folks here in Boston helped. And we did that by marching and taking over buildings and at the embassy and having other people get arrested. And we did it every single day for a year, every day. We didn't care what the weather was, or we didn't care what it was. And every day in the morning, the group of us, the little steering committee, met in my living room and dining room to figure out the strategy for the day. The African American Museum asked me, could they have the table? And I told them no, because I'm still eating off of it. You can have it when I die. But anyway, and we won the sanctions bill, and we passed it once, and he vetoed it, and we just went out again and marched again for another year. And we had great bipartisan help in the Congress of people who helped us to get it passed, and we were able to figure out a way to do that despite Reagan's vow to have constructive engagement with the Afrikaner regime. We prevented Robert Bork, and if you don't know who he is, Bork was like Alito and Thomas and Scalia. You must have heard of them. We kept him off the Supreme Court. We also passed an immigration bill called Simpson-Mazzoli, which was called IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which gave amnesty to hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants. We did that during the Reagan administration. And we laid the groundwork for the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of that we did while he was president. And we did it, part of what we did on the various acts we got passed was to use the label that we were restoring the law. It wasn't anything new. We came up with this idea, just say it's a restoration act. We're just trying to, there's a little crack in it over here, and we just try and fix it. And instead of sending a piece of furniture to the place to be restored, we're just going to pass this little bill, and that's going to fix it. And who could be opposed to restoration? I mean, my goodness. Blue smoke and mirrors. But anyway, we did it. Now, I believe, to leave you finally, since I can't stay up here and talk all day, that in every generation, somebody has to be the activist group. Somebody, as I put it, has to go through the fire to make the change that has to be made. And that every generation, in my view, has the responsibility to make a dent in the wall of injustice. This is your generation. This is your time. We have to show that the immoral do not inherit the earth or the fullness thereof, because we have to, as Martin would put it, heal fundamentally our democracy and redeem the spirit of America. And so what I say is that work on these issues, and if you ever despair, when I used to despair about these things, my mother would say, "Oh, honey, God is my president and Speaker of my house." That's what she said. And then I would talk back to her in my head, because I wouldn't dare talk to her out loud. And I would say, "Yeah, Mama, that's true, but the Lord helps those who help themselves." So our task is helping ourselves and each other to spread the ideas of equality, community, and justice, to resist and move forward, and be strategic when we do it. And in this way, we will make liberty and justice for all a reality in our time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Berry. That was inspirational, and I think I can safely say that this is not a group of people that are going to stay in the lane. That, Dr. Berry, you are in a room of activists, and we're going to do our very best to put a big dent in that wall that you spoke of. The wall of justice.